Once upon a time, when we were housed at another Adobe, was a student here and spent time working with John at the CTBTO. Then for many years was a program officer at the MacArthur Foundation and is now working in a variety of capacities, including as a special advisor to the Oppenheimer Project. So they're all different kinds of connections to Monterey. But what prompted this particular gathering, among other things, was an article that he published about a month ago, a little over a month ago, in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, is that the right title? Looking at the intersection of climate change and nuclear power. And this was also a portfolio that he handled for a period of time at MacArthur. And given the interests that a number of our colleagues have, do we have some of them online? We do. In this area, I thought it made sense for Theo to come down and to share his perspectives with us. And so we'll let him do that. We'll let him, then some of us will break for a bite to eat, and then we'll come back here a little after 3 and focus in particular on some kind of new projects that we are contemplating, where we think Theo might be an asset to us in a variety of ways. So that's the formal introduction, but Theo, it's great to have you back in the fold, so to speak. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Bill, and hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm so excited to be back in Monterey. It's even more beautiful than I remember it. And it's great to meet all of you and to be in conversation with you today. So yeah, as Bill mentioned, today we thought I'd talk a little bit about my background and my experience as a grant maker at the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago, and then talk about a little bit about some key issues that some of us call the climate nuclear nexus. I don't want this to be a boring one-sided lecture. I do have some prepared remarks, but I'm hoping that it will be, sufficiently provocative to have a conversation with all of you. So as Bill mentioned, I once sat where some of you are sitting now, pursuing a master's degree here at MIS. And honestly, it took me years. I'm something of a late bloomer in life in many ways. It took me quite a few years to develop a clear understanding of the history and politics of nuclear affairs and the international architecture set up to reduce and eliminate threats posed by nuclear weapons, materials, and technologies. So it may come as a surprise to you that I'm writing in a philanthropy trade journal about how important it is for funders to support work on nuclear power. After all, we all learn very clearly and repeatedly over time that nuclear technologies are dual use. And so therefore nuclear power is fundamentally connected to the world's most destructive weapons. So what on earth is a CNS alumni doing advocating for more focus and attention on nuclear power? The answer is that it took me quite a few years to come to that as well. And really, if I isolate one turning point, it was just the sort of fluke of timing of me joining the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation in 2015. So I mentioned this in the piece, but as many of you probably know, 2015 was when the MacArthur Foundation was launching its Big Bets model, which is basically fewer, larger resources in fewer areas, trying to achieve transformative policy change in areas of profound concern. So that was 2015. Two of the main topics were climate solutions and nuclear challenges. In the climate context, that was right around the time of the Paris Climate Accords, the largest sort of diplomatic agreement to date on climate change. And also for nuclear issues, that was during the Obama administration's leadership of the Nuclear Security Summit process to lock down loose fissile material. And so that was right when I joined as we were launching these two big programs. So one thing I observed early on was we started to put, to launch these multi-million-dollar programs. And so we were focusing on reducing nuclear risks on one side and reducing climate risks on the other. But when it came to nuclear power, this deeply controversial technology linking these two programs together, we were mostly doing one of two things, ignoring it altogether, or funding institutions and organizations that have maintained a long-standing and fervent opposition to the technology. And so continuing on this path probably would have been fine, except that there's this sort of nagging, unmistakable trend in the climate literature saying that nuclear power is super important for decarbonization. And so one sort of early insight or line of thinking that I had was that opposing nuclear power on safety or security grounds, and we all know the long list of safety or security grounds to oppose nuclear power on, Chernobyl, Fukushima, what's happening with Zaporizhia right now, nuclear proliferation. Opposing it on those grounds while offering no viable plan to decarbonize the global energy and industry systems without nuclear power is just a way that we're missing the bigger picture. And so as a grant maker at MacArthur, as an internal advisor for the climate program and a grant maker on the nuclear challenges program, my view was that wasn't good enough. And so another thing is, as a grant maker, I saw my job as trying to be a good steward of the foundation's resources. So making the best investments based on the strategies that we developed. But also there's something else to it, which is that philanthropy, when it's at its best, I think philanthropy should be something of a risk capital in society, funding bold giving strategies and controversial issues that are in need of attention. And so, after all, if an organization like MacArthur that has hundreds of millions of dollars and a board of 10 to 12 people to be accountable to isn't taking risks and trying new things, then who is? And so I thought part of the job at the intersection of climate and nuclear issues was to push the envelope a little bit. And so what I ended up doing was trying to support a grant make. It was not a ton of grant making, honestly. Most of it was on nuclear risk reduction, but something between $7 and $10 million over the years on productive evidence-based engagement on the future of nuclear energy as a climate solution. And I think that there's an argument to be made that work was worthwhile, and the policy landscape now is becoming quite favorable to nuclear power. And I think that there's something to be said about trying to support work that's multidisciplinary and stuff. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I want to step back a bit and give a little bit more context about my thinking of the context on the climate nuclear nexus. And so just some of the basics. So as the climate crisis, grows more dire and threatens to spin out of control, policy debates are intensifying on the role of nuclear power in decarbonizing the global economy. And so nuclear power is also enjoying a wave of enthusiasm not seen since the so-called nuclear renaissance that many of us remember that sort of came crashing down after the Fukushima Daiichi, triple disaster of earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear accident back in 2011. So the enthusiasm's back. It's backed by a long string of bipartisan legislation in the United States, significant financing, and political leaders within the US and abroad announcing plans to maintain existing nuclear power plants, extend their lives, and also support new nuclear power. There's also a growing number, as I mentioned before, of credible assessments pointing to the need to double or triple or greater the global nuclear power stockpile. And so at the same time, enthusiasm about a nuclear re-renaissance is coming up against sober assessments about the many challenges that a nuclear expansion would entail, and skepticism based in a track record of evidence about whether the nuclear industry is capable of delivering new nuclear power at a time and scale that is required to make a significant impact for the climate. And so just to editorialize a bit here, in my view, I think that in the absence of strong US leadership, international cooperation, and new policy development, a dramatic expansion of nuclear power plants across multiple continents could very well pose significant proliferation risks. Yet at the same time, growing demand for low and no carbon energy sources may lead us into a more nuclearized world, regardless of our personal, cultural, institutional, or national preferences. And so again, all of these dynamics, in my view, strengthen the case for more investment in policy development across domains now. And as I say in the piece, private philanthropy is largely missing the moment on this work. And I think that climate funders in particular should be stepping into this. And the latest data from the Climate Works Foundation says there's something like $9 billion per year in the US alone for nonprofits working on climate philanthropy. Yet the amount of investment in nuclear power and productive engagement on the future of nuclear power is vanishingly small. Most of the work is either on folks that are concerned about the downsides, or frankly eternal optimists about the technology that see it sort of as a panacea. And so I think that the landscape right now is woefully insufficient. And so as I'm not going to go into all of these details, but the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has issued increasingly grim warnings in recent years about how we're off track to decarbonize the global energy system. And in the 2008 report, Global Warming of 1.5 degrees C, nuclear power generation increases across something like 89 scenarios that they considered, on average by like 2.5 times. And there's other studies from the International Energy Agency, from MIT, from management consulting firms like McKinsey. And based on these findings, the most recent United Nations Climate Conference in Dubai last year, COP28, has become now called like the nuclear COP, because there's this big announcement that some 24 countries are going to triple global nuclear capacity by 2050, right? So whether or not that actually comes to pass is another sort of discussion. But my main point is that policymakers are focused on this, and philanthropy should too. But another primary contention that I want to make is that the plan to dramatically expand nuclear power across multiple continents cannot be left to governments alone. We need experts like the ones in this room, the broader nuclear policy community, to be engaging with climate experts, to develop policies. Climate experts, private industry, finance, to develop policies that anticipate and manage the consequences of a more nuclearized world. And so just a couple more examples. Maybe I'll go to more familiar or territory that folks know maybe better than I do, but some of the proliferation challenges from new nuclear, like a lot of these new SMR companies are planning to be fueled by high assay, low enriched uranium. Now, HALEU, it has some important benefits, including enabling for smaller reactors, improved fuel utilization, less radioactive waste. But it also comes with risks, like CRS, the Congressional Research Service, says that even very small reactors with HALEU would have enough material for multiple nuclear weapons, just one reactor. It would need additional enrichment, but still, there's clear proliferation risks. But at the same time, these companies want to build these reactors to turn a profit and, frankly, build as many as they can, right? So where is the actual dialogue and the engagement on this? It's sort of missing. Also, just a general point, a more nuclearized world could very well entail more enrichment and reprocessing facilities around the world. We all know about the sort of loophole in the NPT, where an inalienable right to the peaceful uses of nuclear technologies could very well become an inalienable right to enrichment and reprocessing. Sort of as the grand bargain of the NPT of non-proliferation for disarmament continues to sort of crumble as nuclear weapons states fail to live up to their disarmament obligations, this could just add another complicating factor. Also, reprocessing. This is another big area that needs attention. There are some companies and advocates that are advocating for closing the nuclear fuel cycle. There's even a hashtag, "It's only waste if you waste it." Which I think is sort of like nails on the chalkboard for a lot of proliferation. Experts also, there's an effort to change sort of reprocessing to recycling, equating it with, the harmless blue bins in our driveways, So I think there's a real need to have serious consideration of reprocessing. And also to think about what the drivers are of these companies and this interest in reprocessing. Finally, like a geopolitical point, the Russian and Chinese dominance of the nuclear export markets have led to sort of warnings about the rise of an autocratic nuclear marketplace. And with the U.S. not involved, that could create, real concern for the future of the non-proliferation regime. This makes me think of like sort of the concept, you either have a seat at the table or you're on the menu. In this case, the U.S. is sort of the main course, a la carte, so that's not good for any of us, especially those of us that believe that the U.S. has a role to play in strengthening and preserving the non-proliferation regime. So I want to move towards a discussion here, but I mean my main point is that the climate crisis is, in my view, it's changing the value proposition for expertise in nuclear policy, non-proliferation, export control, international governance, and I think that, as I said before, ruling out nuclear power on safety and security grounds with no larger plan for the climate is just not good enough. In my view, I think that we have to think bigger and bolder about these challenges. And so I think I'll just stop there, Bill.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Theo. I just can't tell who we have on the line here. Okay, so let's see what others. One question I have just to, follows on the article that you published, and that is to get a sense of what kind of traction, if any, did you get from this piece? Did it hit a nerve? Did it generate, much interest on the part of some of the stakeholders that you would hope would be engaged in this kind of discussion? Or like many things that we have published over the years,
Yeah.
go down a black hole?
Yeah, I think I like to think that it, had this big, impact, but I feel like mostly it's preaching to the converted. I heard some positive feedback from people but many of those people were folks that I knew already, saw the shape of the problem and the opportunities in a way that I did. I think, the Chronicle of Philanthropy liked it, and so they were interested in it. That was a good indication. But I don't know. I think one article, it's not likely to sort of, and it's also just an opinion piece. So I mean, it didn't really have the desired impact. But some people were excited about it.
Yeah, you must have participated in the past, or maybe you didn't, but in the Peace and Security Funders group. I think there was just a meeting there last week. Do you have any sense of whether kind of this is something that they are contemplating, given the fact that MacArthur is going to drop this particular?
Yeah, Alex Toma, the executive director of the Peace and Security Funders Group, is a friend, and I served on her board for quite a few years. And she just wrote to me yesterday saying that nuclear energy came up a couple of times, but from my experience with private philanthropy, they're not often on the vanguard. Really, they're more likely to follow trends, unfortunately. And so I think, my hope, and part of what I tried to say in the article is like, sort of regardless of your own personal preferences about nuclear power, policymakers are moving forward. The private industry is moving forward. There's something like 90 SMR, small modular reactor designs under development right now. Like all of these forces are moving. And so philanthropy can and should be stepping in to bring real experts to bear on these conversations.
Thanks. I'm going to move over here so I can see the board here too. If people want to raise their hands, those who are connected with us virtually. But I see Jessica has a question, so please, Jessica.
Thank you. Yeah, so for a number of years, I actually taught a seminar here on nuclear energy and peaceful applications of nuclear technology. And so this is a huge interest of mine, this intersection. And I found, similar to you, that the funding community in general tends to be on climate or nuclear and not really super interested in mixing the two.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that I struggle with, and maybe the answer is that this is one of the first things, if you're putting an agenda like this forward, that you seek to fund, is my personal sense was that the prerequisite to any of the other millions of research projects one could do on how do you make it safe, how do you make it secure, which new technology should we implement, et cetera, is how do you create an environment in which this is either feasible from a market perspective, which would have to be the case in a place like the United States,
Mm-hmm.
or acceptable in a context where market incentives are not at play. Because essentially what I've seen in recent decades is nuclear does not work in a pure market sense unless you figure out a way to internalize the externalities of carbon. And from a price standpoint, I don't see, even when we've had oil crises, a situation where that happens unless there are specifically policy interventions designed at changing the market incentives. And so what we see now are the only countries really pursuing new nuclear build, are those where the government can subsidize it, and there's essentially an authoritarian push to say this is happening whether you like it or not. So how do we contend with that as kind of the forerunner to any of the other conversations?
Yeah.
Is my
It's a huge challenge, and I mean, I'm not an economist, but I do know that, the Biden administration has tried to incentivize nuclear new build in the United States. I think I would just make a larger point where if the U.S. doesn't figure this out, then what's going to happen is the continuation of Russian and Chinese dominance of nuclear exports, which I think is a challenge, a geopolitical challenge that we can all agree is something that is worthy of attention. I think, there's been, if you listen to like Jigar Shah from the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office, he'll often point to, the failings of private industry or the need of private industry to step in. It's a huge quagmire, and I think there's sort of like the Spider-Man meme, where it's like there's three Spider-Men pointing at each other, trying to figure out who's going to move first, And so I think it's something that needs to, that we need to, it's a nut that we need to crack. But one thing that gives me hope is, at least for figuring out new nuclear build along the lines of needing it for geopolitical reasons, is this, the advent of data processing needs for artificial intelligence, and these big tech companies coming out saying that they will be energy off-takers and trying to stimulate new nuclear build based on the great energy demands for artificial intelligence. But it's definitely in the air. I mean, I was just at San Francisco Climate Week a couple weeks ago, and we were trying to have a 10 to 15, we with the Oppenheimer Project, trying to have a 10 to 15 person roundtable on AI data processing and nuclear power, and like 150 people signed up. There's representatives from the IAEA, from the Department of Energy, and so there's a great interest. There's a demand signal to try to figure this out, and I think that things are shifting. But I mean, it's a huge challenge, especially with what happened with the Voto plant going billions of dollars over in years past. I mean, it's a tough proposition, but it's something that I believe quite strongly that we need to figure out one way or the other.
Thanks, Theo. Jeffrey?
Yeah, I was wondering if you'd say a little bit more about the SMR companies, because I remember kind of during the last go round with the nuclear renaissance, there were a lot of us who thought nuclear power would be an important part of this mix, and it was going to happen whether we liked it or not, and so we should, do the kind of work that you're talking about, which is think about what kind of institutions and structures we would want. But in that last go round, whenever we would get in the room with particularly U.S. industry, I mean, they were a nightmare. Largely because they aren't in the business of building boring reactors, right? Because that capability is all overseas, and so they were like, well, you had like a lot of companies that, there was the people who want to do Silex, and you had people who want to reprocess, and people who want to do fast reactors, none of which is really kind of like they had a bad business case, so they were not a particularly good partner. And so I wonder if the SMR companies, like if you could say something about like, what they're like, who they are, where they plan to get fuel services, where they're based, because it seems to me like that for this to work, you need a partner in industry that's not insane.
Yeah.
Surely you've dealt with like the old closed fuel cycle people.
Yeah, I've dealt a little bit with them. I mean, one thing I can say is that we funded, when I was at the MacArthur Foundation, we funded a project at Third Way to map the SMR companies. And so I think that I would refer you to that to shed some light on. I mean, it's a quite dynamic space. I mean, there's a bunch of different companies, and most of them, I think you're right. I mean, they're paper reactors, right? I mean, there's ideas on paper, but actually getting them built is a whole other proposition. Also with what happened with NuScale's financing a few months ago, that really gives folks pause. But I think, again, I'll just return to I'm totally dodging your question, Jeffrey, because I don't think I'm really prepared to answer it.
It's a useful question, right? To sort of follow up on,
Yeah, totally. And so I think, I just got back from a workshop actually that Ingrid Kirsten from the Vienna Center organized in South Africa with some reactor vendors, IAEA people, and there's so much enthusiasm and interest in new SMR technologies. I think part of the challenge is that there's these dividing lines, right? Like LWRs are like boring and big and slow and expensive at first, and so now we're going over to small modular reactors. I think the point is like there's such a tremendous need for low and no carbon energy that like those sorts of tensions between the different types of technologies is not helpful. And I think there's also real challenges with the model of just the government saying, it's up to private industry, and the private industry having this, long and arduous track record. I mean, there's been just like a few nuclear reactors built at all in the US in the last few decades. And so I think that, there's limits to my optimism about all this, but there is a lot of dynamism that's restarting. And the other thing, though, is that all this is so fragile because of what happened after Fukushima. Like, if something were to go wrong in any of the reactors happening right now, but I mean, again, like the climate science says we need to build a bunch of new ones. So how are we going to figure this out? And my point as a grant maker is like we need to have more investment in figuring all this stuff out.
Have you done this talk in Vienna yet?
No.
Bill.
I just heard it myself.
I'm just saying, because I think that would be an interesting
No,
place to have this conversation.
It's a good idea. Let's put that on the list of things to follow up this afternoon. That's a good suggestion. French, you want to do that?
Natasha's first. And Natasha's first.
I can see her. Oh, I'm sorry. Natasha.
Thank you.
Here.
Yeah, no worries. Theo, thank you so much for your remarks. I think you and I have talked at length about how there's an absence of objective analysis out there about which SMR is the right SMR. How will the SMR renaissance affect safeguards? All the analysis that we would hope there to be from our perspective is not being done. In fact, when I did extensive research into SMRs, I found a lot of great SMRs are going to save the world, but they were, predictably marketing materials by the different companies who are trying to raise funding. So going back to your point about the data centers and AI tech companies potentially being an ally here, if we're thinking about fundraising, they would probably be interested in some objective analysis paving the way for that. Are they potential sources of funding if we wanted to do that kind of research in your mind?
I mean, I think they should be. Most of these big corporations have a corporate social responsibility arm. And so now, I mean, this is a new thing. This announcement a couple of these announcements just came out recently about trying to be supportive of new nuclear for AI data centers. But I think it's definitely something worth pursuing. Yeah, we should talk about that, Natasha. And also I have to say, Natasha was amazingly supportive and helpful with us at MacArthur, and she came to one of our private meetings talking about these issues. But she did some of the work that we funded at MacArthur with the Council on Strategic Risks.
Thanks, Theo. Please, Brent.
Yeah, I guess I'm maybe a dinosaur or something, but if you're looking, for example, looked a lot about SMRs and different technologies and all that stuff. If you look at the IAEA SMR book, which I haven't looked at in a while, they don't focus on the proliferation aspects at all. And so I still wonder how much emphasis is being placed on the non-proliferation aspect of these reactors. So I think that's a very important thing to have to focus on. The other thing is, I don't want to be a stick in the mud and all this stuff, but safety is a very important issue. I know you know this already, so I don't want to say the same thing over and over again. But the safety aspect, whether people are being irrational about it or illogical about it or not, has humongous economic impacts, as we've seen in Japan, as we've seen in South Korea, which has nothing to do with the dumping of the water or anything like that. You still had these ripple effects which affected the economy. So while we have to kind of take this into account in our calculations when we're doing estimates, but I do see that there's an important role to play. But don't discount the safety aspect. That's what I'm saying.
I mean, I didn't mean to discount that, and if I did, I take it back. My only point is that decarbonizing the global energy system, like it's still 80% dominated by fossil fuels. So, the idea of decarbonizing heavy industry, transportation, the whole entire global economy is a challenge of unprecedented scale and magnitude and complexity, right? And what's the largest clean energy source in the US? It's nuclear, right? Or hydro or whatever. It's one of the largest. And so I think these are sort of, all I'm saying is taking it off the table for safety or security reasons with no plan to decarbonize, that in my view is no longer a relevant sort of objection in the context of a climate disaster.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, MacArthur at one point supported research in this area. Is there any funder, philanthropy that is continuing to support research, not necessarily promote nuclear energy, but to at least look at the possible contributions as well as the negative implications that one has to be aware of? Is there some place that's supporting this at the moment?
So there is a small handful of funders in the US that are working on nuclear power issues. I named a couple of them in the piece, but the Breakthrough Energy, which is a spinoff of the Gates Foundation, they're very much focused on nuclear energy. The Spitzer Charitable Trust, they don't have a website, but they're quite focused on that. The Pritzker Innovation Fund has some work on that. And this was what made it different at MacArthur. What I was doing was bringing together like Ambassador Laura Holgate to work with like the third way nuclear optimists to have a real conversation with, or like Ken Luongo from Partnership for Global Security to work with NEI. What those groups aren't doing is bringing together experts like those around this table and in the nuclear risk reduction community, bringing that expertise to bear on the nuclear climate conversation. And so that's a big piece of what I think is missing. And because what those conversations need to have is questions like what Ferenc asked about safeguards. That's a huge question about how we're gonna do the material accountancy, the safeguards reforms within the IAEA. As we all know around this table, like zero growth budget and a global mandate for ensuring that nuclear activities remain peaceful. I mean, that's just a huge challenge. And so again, my only point is like, we need more philanthropic support and attention on this. But I think that there is a small group of committed funders on it, but they just aren't necessarily focused on this community. And there are, I think there are cultural and historical reasons for that. But again, this goes back to, I think what we need in the nuclear policy community, in my view, is that we need to think about the climate crisis as changing the value proposition for this expertise to where it can be marshaled for productive, forward-looking use about these questions, rather than just sort of ending the conversation at, of course we can't do it because there's safety and security risks. So.
Thanks. Yes, please.
We have a question from George Morrow.
Yeah, George, thank you. Thanks.
I guess one of the things that I see in terms of work that can be done is there are many claims made by the SMR manufacturers or potential manufacturers that are just, to my opinion, not true. And I'll give you an example. Some of them have claimed that they will be really economic by putting these sites on the sites of old fossil fuel plants, therefore making everything wonderful, and they'll use the steam components of the fossil fuel plants and not have to do anything other than just supply steam to the fossil fuel plant in order to join the electrical grid. The problem with something like that is it doesn't take into account the fact that small modular reactors and reactors in general provide very poor quality steam. Fossil fuel plants are optimized to use, for example, superheated steam. When you start blowing poor quality steam into those plants, I would expect that the steam generators in those plants, the turbines, will not last very long at all. So that's one level of looking at it. Then there's the whole question of non-proliferation, what can be done to bring up the, can you commit to this? Can you look at ideas like the old IAEA idea of fuel bank and fuel resources that sort of thing. Anyway, I think there's at least 2 or maybe 3 levels of projects that would need to be usefully funded to look at just the SMR component of this.
I agree with that. I think, thank you for those points. The International Fuel Bank is an example that I referenced. The NTI-IAEA International Fuel Bank is something that I mentioned in the piece as some creative thinking about how to figure out what to do about if set aside whether or not we're actually going to be able to dramatically expand nuclear power, but if these policymakers succeed, like how do we obviate the need for or interest of countries to enrichment and reprocessing? I mean, the fuel bank is one example, but we need more creative thinking about how to figure these things out, for sure.
Thanks, Theo. Please, Yan, do you want to introduce yourself to, well, I think everybody knows you, but nonetheless, Theo doesn't, so.
Yeah. So my name is Yan Liang. I am a research assistant for Dr. Potter, soon to become a research associate at CNS. Currently a student. I'm graduating in a week or so. And I'm particularly interested in the Russian and Chinese nuclear industries. My question is with regard to the assumption that I think you reiterated that the US technological leadership in nuclear power is critical for global nonproliferation. I mean, I think the US government has done great things for nonproliferation, but what I see right now is that when you look at Russia and China, the big builders in nuclear, what they are building, these units are essentially traditional PWRs. Low enrichment uranium, sort of their highest enrichment, right? For the 4th generation advanced reactor, which is technically HALEU, it's like 8.5%. It's nowhere close to the 20% that some of the US industry stakeholders are proposing. And these countries, by the way, do have commercially mature advanced reactor and SMR technology. So it's not like they're forced to build these boring plants. They're making a conscious choice in terms of choosing PWRs. But it's the US commercial nuclear industry that's sort of choosing the exotic HALEU-fueled or reprocessed plutonium-fueled reactors, in particular with regard to the military microreactors that are being developed. I mean, I heard an argument coming from the Project Pele program manager. He said 20% HALEU is actually the sweet spot in terms of nonproliferation because it doesn't produce as much plutonium as LEU. And so my question here is, how do you reconcile that with the argument that US technological leadership in nuclear is good for nonproliferation? Because if the US technologies that are being proposed right now became the norm, I would rather see Chinese and Russian PWRs from a nonproliferation perspective.
Hey, that's an awesome point. I think that the only thing that I would say is that, I don't have any sort of response on technological grounds. I think those are fair points, and I'm not somebody that's going to be a booster of one sort of exotic fuel types or SMRs that require a closed fuel cycle. That's for sure. And so I don't mean to be overly nationalistic here, but I think that there's more than just technological aspects at play, right? There's also international governance, leadership, ensuring that the overall system functions accordingly. I think, just for one example, I don't think that the Russians have acquitted themselves very well on the international stage in terms of nuclear leadership, turning themselves into a predatory nuclear weapon state and overrunning Chernobyl and Zaporizhia. I don't know if that's the example that I would want to necessarily follow. But I think that my only point is that the U.S. leadership has been critical to establishing and maintaining the international non-proliferation regime, from the PTBT to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the CTBT, of course, and others. I don't mean to be wrapping myself in the flag here or anything, but I do take your points on the technological grounds.
Yes, Jeffrey.
Yeah, well, it just sort of picks up on kind of my concern, which is not, it's not about who's right or wrong per se. It's just about the kind of the practicality from how do we come up with a work program issue, where what Yan Liang mentioned is that the problem is that US industry is behind. and they want to catch up, and all their ideas of catching up are like very sci-fi oriented. So during the last nuclear renaissance, they were just bad partners for those of us who would show up and say like, no, we want more nuclear power. We just want to figure out how to make it safe. And we want to think about safeguards. And the challenge is like, well, the easiest thing to safeguard are like just pretty boring power reactors. But US industry doesn't really make those. So it's just an interesting question. I think it is, we just have to think about how to solve it. But if we want to have a robust discussion in the United States with, largely US funding about how you make the world safer for nuclear power, we just have this problem of US industry not always being as constructive, I think, as we'd like it to be. Because they would, they were like eager to reprocess because that was like their argument for why you should do that instead of a Chinese PWR.
Anybody else care to weigh in at this time? I'm trying to reconcile what I hear in this room, which I find very interesting, with what I tend to hear in multilateral negotiations, discussions about sort of three issues at NPT meetings, and the disconnect there is that I never hear among NPT diplomats who are usually very strong advocates of greater reliance upon nuclear energy. Any of the concerns that we're expressing here with respect to nuclear safety and non-proliferation, I mean, it may appear ironic, but those points simply don't, arise. It's as if it's not even an issue. That this is, there's this inherent right to pursue nuclear energy, nuclear power, other peaceful uses of nuclear energy as part of the grand bargain. And there may be these other pillars of the treaty, but those aren't really relevant, to pillar 3. There are institutions that have responsibilities. So it is also somewhat of a surreal kind of a quality to the debates that one hears among individuals who presumably would appreciate the kinds of points that, France has made. And I suspect that to some extent, this disconnect will become even more pronounced. You could call it the Zaporizhia, kind of effect here, because you had, the relatively rare occurrence of major nuclear accidents as a depressing phenomenon. But now you have kind of dedicated policy to attack nuclear power facilities, and that has to have some impact on the market. I would assume, particularly if you're talking about the larger facilities. So I guess what I'm getting at here, when I just note some of these contradictions, I'm not really aware of studies that begin with a more open mind about both the potential and the problems that may come from a greater investment in nuclear energy. And so where would you go to be educated on that? Or is there a need still for that kind of a study?
I think there's a need for it. I think, I just keep, maybe I'm that horrible phrase, beating a dead horse or something, but I just keep going back to this experience as a grantmaker at MacArthur where, I'm representing the Nuclear Challenges Program, but also as an advisor to the climate program, I would speak with folks in our community and they would, explain things like what you said about Zaporizhia or SMRs and safeguards. And then I would say, what about all the climate science that says we need nuclear? And invariably their response would be like, I don't know, it's not my field, And I'm just like, that's not good enough. We need to think bigger, And so I think part of it and part of what I was trying to point to in the piece is we need much more investment to anticipate and manage the consequences of building out a bunch more nuclear facilities. But not to mention all the complexity of actually getting that done.
I mean, the other issue that, I mean, wasn't raised, but I think also it has to be part of this conversation, when you talk about greater investment, wherever it may come from, are alternative, energy sources and also conservation. And so there's a question of what you get for the investment. So again, without prejudging the outcome of that analysis, I think that has to also be on the table here. Sid, yeah, I thought, I was waiting for you to weigh in here, because I know this is a great interest of yours, so please, come on in.
It is indeed, Bill, and thanks. I knew you'd call on me. So, Theo, first of all, thanks for your comments, and most of all, let me actually thank you for all those years of support from the MacArthur Foundation while you were there, and it was an enormous help to me when I was at Stanford. It allowed me to do Russia, China, North Korea, India, Pakistan, and Iran, and so forth. So, I really, all of us are going to miss the MacArthur Foundation and all the good things that it did. But let me just make, Bill, I think I'll just make some general comments, because from what I understand, we'll have a brainstorming session later on, right, in the afternoon. Okay, so the general comments, Theo, I very much like your approach of saying, let's look at the nuclear power piece. In other words, the beneficial piece of things nuclear, and not just look at the downside and the risk of things nuclear. And that's really pretty much the side that I've come down on for many, many years. With all the risks that are there associated with things nuclear, I just don't see how you can get countries to actually help you manage and mitigate those risks if you don't let them have some of the benefits on the other side. You've pointed out that right now, those benefits on the other side, particularly need to be looked at because of the concerns about global climate change. And even though, some of those risks in the nuclear world were just mentioned here, and I say, in the end, they all have to be weighed against the risks and the specific things that we know we're already doing to us by burning fossil fuels. So in the end, it's a trade-off between risks of nuclear power, other forms of energy, and then it's the trade-off between the risks and the benefits. And so that the initiative of having you look at the positive side of things nuclear, the nuclear power, and then trying to find a way to have the sort of NGO community, the funding community, bring the NGOs into places is really, really important here. Because in the nuclear arena, of course, you can't do anything, without the government, having some major role. And then you have the industry on the other side, and industry, whether it's any other industry or the nuclear industry, of course, it has its own objectives, and those objectives are to make money, so they're driven by something different than the government is necessarily driven by. And in the nuclear arena, the industry part is especially complicated, and it's particularly complicated for the United States right now. And so, for example, we can criticize why the U.S. wants to go to its small modular reactors, but one of the main reasons for that is just the U.S. nuclear industry, is almost defunct. It can't build reactors anymore. Places like Westinghouse, essentially just an engineering firm. They're really not a nuclear construction firm. And so one of the reasons we've seen the small modular reactors, in my opinion, come along is just the economics part, and where U.S. industry might actually maybe become, competitive. So the industry, government, Nexus is really important, and that's where more NGO involvement and all those things that you mentioned as to what need to be done, I think is just imperative that it's done. So I congratulate you for taking this angle and hopefully, being able to bring more NGO expertise to take a look at both the industry and government pieces. And I'll share some of my specific thoughts with you when we get together later. But thank you.
Thank you, Sig, and thank you for those the encouragement and the constructive comments. Sig was an amazing asset to us at MacArthur, and we called on him often, testing his generosity as an advisor to us over the years. So thank you for that, Sig. And I just to respond to that a bit, I think the way I think about this is I'm not like a pro-nuclear power advocate for the sake of nuclear, like because it's cool or because it's so great and shiny and exciting, or I love reprocessing or something. I think about it as there's a nuclear necessity to avoid a climate disaster. So I'm just not convinced that we can do it without nuclear power. That's the driving force. So it's not, I think that in my view, what we need to do is get beyond this discussion of nuclear, should we or shouldn't we, or hand-wringing about the challenges, and move towards the how. Because that's where it really gets super complicated from an economics perspective, a security perspective, governance, workforce development, the list goes on and on and on. But I think part of the complexity of the how creates an environment for folks to grind their ideological axes, anti or pro. And so this, again, gets me back to this point where it's like we need private resources of philanthropy to support real expert engagement for folks like around in this room, like for SIG and others to be in the room that have these perspectives that are multidisciplinary, informed by actual fact and not by ideology.
Yes.
And one more thing I want to say is like we don't have to go far to find leadership on this that shows an understanding of the promise and the peril of nuclear technology. Like Director General Grossi is a tremendous leader on these issues, like negotiating the Iran nuclear deal. Obviously, he understands the nuclear risks, but also being a huge advocate for peaceful uses and being largely solely responsible for taking the UN climate conference from being totally ignoring nuclear to making it front and center at the most recent climate conference. And so he's one example. There are other champions out there. Ambassador Holgate is also has been a great champion over the years, but also having that credibility of being informed by non-proliferation expertise. And I see that as really missing, especially given that the MacArthur Foundation has left. I think that on the, now the nuclear funding landscape is sort of a, smoldering pile of embers. It's quite, depressing. But I think on the other hand, from the MacArthur Foundation's perspective, and I helped to craft these arguments where it's like, this is a global, multi-generational collective action problem, as nuclear challenges are. And so the idea that one foundation in Chicago is responsible for maintaining that, being the most generous beneficiary over the years and continuing that into perpetuity with no other, not a lot of other major funders stepping in, that's sort of an unrealistic proposition. And so I think it's time for others to step in. And frankly, in my view, it's time for climate philanthropy to step in.
Thank you, Theo. What I'm inclined to do here, and I don't want to discourage anybody who may have a question from asking it, but since we're concluding or appear to be concluding this session early, I would propose that we begin the brainstorming session perhaps at 2 o'clock rather than at 3:15. Because I know there's some people who had difficulty with the later hour. I wanted to leave some time for get a bite to eat. So what I would propose is that we express our appreciation to Theo at this time, then take a break, and we'll then move into a more private format for the afternoon session, and we'll resume in this room at maybe, let's say, 2:30.
2:30, okay.
Does that work for everybody? Okay, so please join me in thanking Theo for